There is a legend that sometime in the 1st century, just after the death of Jesus, a boat full of refugees from the Holy Land arrived in the south of France. The story says the group included some of the closest followers of Jesus, Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead, and the repentant prostitute named Mary Magdalene. But what if we told you there was more to the story? What if we told you that some people think Mary Magdalene was not a repentant prostitute, but instead the wife of Jesus, that she bore his child, that there is a bloodline that survived, that the truth was suppressed by the church, but handed down through a secret society, whose most famous member was Leonardo da Vinci, and that Leonardo encoded the truth in some of his most famous paintings. These are extraordinary claims that have a lot of people talking these days because they appear in the best-selling book called The Da Vinci Code, a fictional thriller that begins with a murder in the Louvre, the famous French museum. Since its debut, the book has captured the imagination of millions worldwide and has even become an industry. At the Louvre, there are 7 different Da Vinci Code tours being offered by enterprising tour guides.
We would be with visitors in front of Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks, and the questions just kept coming about, secret codes hidden in this painting. We used the book as a kind of way to approach the art collection. So, of course, we point out where things happen in the plot, where the curator is murdered.
In the novel, a body is found near Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. A baffling cipher next to it, a message that the book slowly unravels. There is a chase through the streets of Paris, and as the plot unfolds, a series of mysterious clues seem to reveal an astonishing historical secret: Mary Magdalene's true identity.
Although she doesn't literally appear in the book, she's basically the book's main character. And the book has created a huge interest, especially in some of our, female visitors, finding out more about who is this Mary Magdalene? How has she been understood throughout history?
Most often depicted as the repentant prostitute in popular culture, the novel says that Mary Magdalene is actually the most important person in Jesus' ministry, that she is his wife and the mother of his child. The book is, of course, fiction, but in a controversial introductory note, the author writes that many of the historical underpinnings to the plot are accurate. Or are they?
That information has been around for quite a while, and there have been a lot of books written about this theory. The interesting thing is that they're all history tomes that sit sort of in the back corner of bookstores. And what's happened now is that the Da Vinci Code has taken a lot of that information and put it forth in a different sort of genre, and there's an enormous portion of the population now that is hearing this for the first time, and it feels brand new.
Critics say that the historical claims made by the author range from questionable to outlandish. For example, the book suggests that the pyramid in front of the Louvre is a symbol of the sacred feminine and the sacred male. It says that the real identity of Mary Magdalene has been intentionally suppressed, that in a well-known church in Scotland, more clues can be found to prove this theory, that the secret was preserved and has been handed down by a small group, which included the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
It's the filling in of a blank, and it's a filling in of a blank for which we have absolutely no evidence. I can suggest all kinds of things happened historically if there's no evidence for them and say, oh, believe this. but there's not one shred of evidence for it.
But where did these claims originate? We set out to examine whether any of the claims laid out in the book line up with historical fact or truth, where the author got his facts, and to examine some of the same evidence. Our reporting took us from here in southern France to England to Italy to Jerusalem. What we found is that some of the claims the book makes are simply not credible, and some of the claims have been made before. But there are some surprising truths behind the story of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Leonardo da Vinci. Jesus and Mary Magdalene likely met here, around the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus spent a lot of time preaching, according to the Bible. Most historians think she was from a town called Migdal, or Magdala, now a ruin. There was once a church here in her honor, but otherwise the place is pretty desolate. Nothing here hints that she was married to Jesus and carried on his bloodline, as the novelist who wrote the Da Vinci Code claims.
I began as a skeptic. As I started researching Da Vinci Code, I really thought I would disprove a lot of this theory about Mary Magdalene and holy blood and all of that. I became a believer.
For centuries, Mary Magdalene has been depicted as a prostitute. Her long hair became her trademark, symbolizing the vanity which the legend said got her into trouble in the first place. Dan Brown thinks she's been misrepresented.
Nowhere in the Bible does it say Mary Magdalene was a prostitute.
And that the church allowed this to happen in order to obscure the truth about her relationship with Jesus. Do you think that that was somehow some sort of effort to not just marginalize her, but impugn her integrity somehow?
I personally do. And it's possible that his relationship with Mary Magdalene really was sort of set aside, and that she was portrayed in some way
as a fallen woman.
As a fallen woman, simply such that we could explain her presence. You know, Jesus wasn't in love with her, he was trying to help her out.
Now, Dan Brown is a novelist, not a religious scholar, but it appears that his first claim that Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute is correct. The common belief today is that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute.
Right. And that common belief is simply false. There's no factual basis for that long-standing tradition that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, a woman of ill repute.
She was not the practitioner of the world's oldest tradition or oldest occupation, as you often hear. She was among a cadre of Jesus' women followers. They were there to kind of sort of be the woman's auxiliary in Jesus' mission. They supported him also financially.
How did Mary Magdalene end up being described as a prostitute for nearly 2,000 years if there isn't any evidence?
A woman who travels around with a group of men, what can this mean? She must be a prostitute. She must be promiscuous in some way. So that reputation might have been part of the rumors swirling around these communities.
And Pagel says there may be another reason.
The Gospels in the New Testament picture Mary Magdalene as someone who had been possessed by devils and had been healed by Jesus.
And unfortunately for Mary Magdalene, she's introduced right after a story about a prostitute whom Jesus forgives for her sins.
But she's introduced in such a way that it seems clear she's not the woman of the previous scene.
So the fact that she had a demon problem doesn't imply at all that Mary Magdalene was sexually promiscuous.
We have to appreciate what demons were in those days, and they're not, not like a science fiction.
What are they?
Basically, it's sickness, illness. And, they didn't have the medical technology and sophistication, so they would attribute to demons, to the evil spirits.
So having demons driven out of her means she basically got better.
He got better, yeah.
However, in the year 591, the Pope at the time, Gregory the Great, gave a big Easter sermon declaring that Mary Magdalene and the unnamed prostitute were, in fact, the same person.
Prior to the 6th century, we do not find any certain connection between Mary and the sinner or between Mary and a prostitute. The demarcation occurs with Gregory. That's an unfortunate circumstance.
The Vatican eventually corrected that impression, but not until 1969, 1,378 years later.
It's astonishing, I think, to me and to many people, how long the belief that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute has survived for well over a millennium without a single shred of evidence to support it.
The scholars we talked with say that what is most unfair about the whole thing is that it has eclipsed the important information the Bible does provide about Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene is one of the greatest saints in the history of the church.
She's perhaps the most frequently mentioned woman who is among the followers of Jesus in the Gospels of the New Testament.
There are 8 lists of women in groups of women traveling with Jesus, and on 7 of those 8 lists, Mary Magdalene is mentioned first.
The Bible says she was at the foot of the cross when Jesus died, along with his mother, while most of the male followers of Jesus had gone into hiding.
Among his friendships, among his disciples, Mary Magdalene was the one closest to him.
Father McBrien told us he thinks Mary Magdalene would have been recognized as one of Jesus' main apostles, and possibly the key apostle if she had been a man.
When Jesus rose from the dead, according to the accounts in the New Testament, in 3 places he appeared to Mary Magdalene first. Mary Magdalene was not only a witness, she was the primary witness, even over Peter. So she had all the credentials to be an apostle.
But does any of this mean that she was married to Jesus? We came here to Jerusalem to look into claims that most recently appeared in a best-selling book called The Da Vinci Code. Claims that have existed for centuries and legends and stories that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were husband and wife, and that they may even have had a child. This is not an easy subject to tackle. There's very little information about what went on in this place in the 1st century, and scholars often take the information that is available and give it wildly differing interpretations. But knowing that, we set out to find out what the Christian Bible tells us about Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
She is obviously one of the intimate followers of Jesus from the standpoint of being a disciple and a follower. What she isn't is married to Jesus or a family that we can tell of, because she isn't named as a relative or anything like that.
We asked the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for the Catholic Church's position on Jesus being married. It said there was no official doctrine on the subject, but that the Church's opinion is he was not married because it is not in the Gospels. Now, it's true that the Bible doesn't say Jesus was married, but it also doesn't say he was single. We asked all kinds of historians whether it was at all possible and got a range of opinion.
Jesus was not married, even though I think, especially in the last 40 years, there have been so many books written trying to get Jesus married off, like some anxious mother for an over-eligible bachelor son, whatever.
I think it's entirely plausible to think that Jesus may have been married. It was a normal practice for Jewish men. It would also be normal not to mention that he had a wife.
It would have been unusual for a rabbi not to be married, but the weight of evidence that we have suggests to me the contrary, that in fact he was a celibate.
Everything that we have in church tradition suggests that Jesus was single.
Is there any evidence in the Bible at all, anything that educates us or tells us whether or not Jesus might have been married?
No.
Nothing either way?
There's nothing. Which doesn't mean now, I'm not saying, therefore, it's impossible that he could have been married. Is it possible he was married? Yes.
That wouldn't threaten his divinity in any way?
Not in my opinion, unless you regard sexual intimacy and the married state as somehow sinful or corrupting, then the answer to your question is no, Jesus could have been married, and it would have been without any compromise whatever.
And still be able to be the Son of God?
Yes, and without any compromise of the church's historic faith in him as truly God and truly human.
Jesus does a lot of things that are very human that don't take away from his divinity. I don't think it would necessarily detract from his divinity if he ended up being married.
But neither Dr. Bach nor Father McBrien thinks Jesus actually was married. They say the strongest evidence is found in the Bible.
One of the earliest writings that we have is by the Apostle Paul, who's not into hiding anything. And he asks a question at one point about whether or not he has the right to have a wife.
Dr. Bach is talking about the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians.
Paul is kind of whining, kind of complaining about the fact that he wanted to be married.
Paul says, don't I have a right to have a wife like the brothers of Jesus and like the other apostles, including Peter? If Jesus had been married, he would have said, don't I have a right to have a wife like Jesus does? He doesn't say that.
Still, the novelist Dan Brown claims that the evidence Jesus was married and married to Mary Magdalene is even more convincing. So where did you find in your research information that led you to believe that she was in fact Jesus' wife?
In that time in history, for a young Jewish man to not be married would have been mentioned. It was practically a sin, and yet there is no mention of that.
In Judaism, you couldn't be not married in that first century. The norm was marriage. They didn't even have a word for bachelor in their language.
Margaret Starbird is the author of several books that Dan Brown relied upon in writing the Da Vinci Code, but she is not a biblical scholar or a theologian.
It was incumbent on a father to find a bride for his son before the young man turned 20. So it was almost unheard of to have someone be not married in Judaism.
But it isn't as clear as Starbird and Brown would want you to believe. While it would have been unusual for a Jew to be single, it would not be unheard of. The so-called Dead Sea Scrolls found here in these caves in the desert outside Jerusalem make that pretty clear. This was a whole community of young Jewish men who had dedicated their lives to God, and the scrolls seem to tell us that they were all unmarried and celibate.
The question of Jesus being married is very interesting. It would be most strange for a Jewish man to be unmarried. On the other hand, we have records, for instance, of John the Baptist, whose pupil Jesus clearly was. Was John the Baptist living in the desert with eating honey and wild locusts? Was he married?
There is a theory that the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes who were celibate, in fact influenced John the Baptist.
If in turn, at least some of the Essenes at Qumran were celibate, who appear as well to have had an influence on John the Baptist, Jesus, and Paul, then why should Jesus himself not have been celibate?
But Starboard points to other pieces of what she says is evidence in the Christian scriptures themselves, the New Testament.
Even though the Bible doesn't overtly say Jesus was married, you say it was written sort of encoded and secretly.
Yes.
Starboard says the facts are there if you just know where to look for them. One place is in the gospel story about a woman named Mary who anoints Jesus' feet with oil and wipes it away with her hair. Starboard says the anointing is identical to other ancient rituals from the region involving the anointing of kings. It is a marriage ritual.
The anointing of the king was actually the nuptial rite. It was the prerogative of the royal bride to anoint her husband, and then they go off to the bridal chamber. So this ancient liturgical rite in this whole area of the Near East is actually celebrated verbatim almost in the four Gospels.
But the Bible does not say the woman who anoints Jesus is Mary Magdalene. It calls her Mary of Bethany. That would make her from this town, today called Al-Azariah, just outside Jerusalem. Nowhere near Migdal and the Sea of Galilee. Starboard's theory is that Mary of Bethany is Mary Magdalene. She says that the word Magdalene does not refer to the place she came from, but is instead a kind of title the Bible writers gave her.
Mary of Bethany is, you say, is Mary Magdalene?
She's called Mary the Magdalene. Why did they call her the Magdalene? Well, first of all, Magdala means tower. So and it also means a high place, an elevated place. So it might have been like Catherine the Great. They're calling her the Great or the Elevated by giving her this epithet. It's definite, in my view, that this woman was not from a town named Magdala.
Why is that so definite?
The town called Magdala did not exist by that name at the time of Jesus.
But when we asked about this claim, Israeli archaeologists contradicted it. They told us the name of the town Migdal did exist in the 1st century when Mary and Jesus would have lived. Nevertheless, there is one other thing Margaret Starboard showed us that did turn out to be intriguing. In the Gospel according to John, Mary Magdalene is crying alone in the garden near his tomb when she is surprised by someone who turns out to be the risen Jesus. She calls out, and he tells her, "Don't touch me," apparently because he is still in a state between life and death.
Mary Magdalene wanted to embrace him, and he said, "Don't touch me, I have not yet ascended to my Father." In other words, he had entered into a new form of existence.
This scene has been painted over and over by great Western artists under the title Noli me tangere, in Latin, "Don't touch me." But the oldest versions of the Gospels, written in Greek, say something a little different.
The Greek actually says, "Do not cling to me," which is a far more intimate verb. In other words, she's really embracing him, and he's saying, "Do not cling to me."
And that kind of embrace would have been unusual if it were not between a man and a woman, husband and wife?
Yes, because they had taboos about women touching a man who was not her husband.
That's part of what made it so shocking.
But Darrell Bach says this doesn't suggest that Jesus and Mary were husband and wife.
It's just her single act of devotion given to him without concern about what people are thinking about what she's doing.
Most other biblical scholars we spoke with agree with Darrell Bach's assessment, but we did find one who thinks the scene in the garden might point to an intimate relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus.
She wasn't going up with her little finger and saying, "Gee, are you real?" She wanted to hug him. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if someone came in and said, "Look, we have evidence now, it's incontrovertible evidence, that Jesus was married. Guess who it was?" And I'd say, it's only a short putt to Mary Magdalene. If he was married, it was obviously
her.
Oh yeah, it's obviously Mary Magdalene.
Closest to him for a Last Supper here in Jerusalem. Centuries later, Leonardo da Vinci would paint this supper as no one had before him. Christ on the eve of his execution, telling his friends that he is about to be betrayed. But did Leonardo hide a message in this painting? Something that has gone unnoticed for generations. Clues about a relationship to a woman whom history has branded a prostitute, Mary Magdalene.
I first learned about Mary Magdalene and Leonardo da Vinci 15 years ago. One day our professor began class by showing us a slide of The Last Supper, which was a painting I thought I understood pretty well. And then he pointed out what I thought was a rather obvious omission, the apparent absence in the painting of the cup of Christ.
That cup, or chalice, the Bible says Jesus used that night, has long been rumored to be the Holy Grail, the lost relic thought to be taken out of Jerusalem and hidden away in Europe for centuries.
The chalice from which the disciples allegedly drank their wine, for some reason Leonardo da Vinci chose to omit.
There's no chalice, no cup anyplace.
So all of us in class are sitting there scratching our heads saying, this is odd, when the professor said, or did he? Maybe the Holy Grail is indeed there. And his belief was that the Holy Grail was in da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper. He said, if you look on the right hand of Jesus, there is the Holy Grail, and her name is Mary Magdalene.
Leonardo lived in Florence in the 15th century. It was a city of controversial geniuses. Botticelli, Michelangelo. Leonardo was known for the subtlety of his drawing and his offbeat ideas.
He was rather an eccentric individual. He loved to dress in velvet clothes, for example. He sported a long, long beard, which is very unusual for the time.
He was the kind of person you probably would have noticed walking down the street.
Oh, you would not have missed him. You would not have missed him. He was very, very commanding in appearance and very greatly respected because he was a great intellectual, very, very learned.
What kind of person was he? Describe him. What was his personality like?
Well, it's very difficult to say. He was a reclusive individual. He was a very, very dedicated, committed intellectual. We don't really know terribly much about his life because not too much was written at the time when he lived about him.
The little we know comes mostly from notebooks he began writing at the age of 30. Thousands of pages covered with his reversed left-handed script. Plans, observations, descriptions, and calculations. Historians told us these notebooks mention nothing about Mary Magdalene. But they do tell us that Leonardo had all kinds of unusual beliefs for his day. He believed men could find a way to fly 5 centuries before the invention of the airplane.
There's a great quote about Leonardo. He was a man who awoke from a deep slumber only to find the rest of the world was still sleeping. Absolutely beautiful. He was an alchemist, a mathematician. He was an architect, an inventor, a man really centuries ahead of his time. And he had the unfortunate challenge of being a modern man of reason who was born into an age of deep religious fervor, an age when science was synonymous with heresy.
And you think this is the kind of man who would hide information in his paintings?
Absolutely, because he was living at a time when this information, you couldn't just stand on a street corner and proclaim how you felt on a topic that was contrary to the church.
Dan Brown believes Leonardo put into his art what he kept out of his notebooks, and that he used his subtle style as a tool for conveying his true beliefs.
When I look at the Mona Lisa, I see a perfect fusion of man and woman. And I think that was his intention.
What do you mean? How do you see that?
It's androgynous. It is not clearly a woman. I would make the argument that Leonardo da Vinci was a skilled enough painter to eradicate any question whatsoever about a subject's sexuality, or rather subject's gender, if he wanted to. The more I learned about da Vinci, the more I started to sense this is the type of man who would tell this story in a very secretive way.
In 1495, Leonardo da Vinci began painting The Last Supper on the wall of the Santa Maria delle Grazie church in Milan.
What about The Last Supper? I mean, there is great supposition, theorizing that the figure next to Jesus that looks to be John is in fact Mary Magdalene. That's a woman sitting next to him instead of a man. And it is a very effeminate man if it's a man.
You know, John is almost always represented as effeminate.
Why is that?
He's young, he's beardless. For example, in most representations of the Last Supper, John lies asleep on the table or asleep on Christ's breast. And that comes out of the Bible, comes out of the Gospel of St. John. If that turns out to be Mary Magdalene, where's John? There were 12 apostles. You have 12 men there besides Christ. Where's John? Has John been then eliminated and replaced by the Magdalene? It doesn't make sense. Communication.
Isn't it possible that that's a woman next to Jesus?
No, of course not.
It looks like a woman.
No, it doesn't.
Why don't you think so?
Because it looks like a young male. I see no breasts. The fact that he has long hair, so does Christ have long hair. So does James, the figure with his arms stretched out, have long hair. So does that figure second from the left have long hair.
But all the other figures, their faces look distinctly masculine, while John's looks quite feminine.
It was just, matter of fact, in most representations of the Last Supper in Florence, he looks like he's a very, very young man.
If you look at that painting, that is clearly a woman.
So why do so many art historians dismiss this as absolutely bizarre and crazy?
I think it's because we see what we've been told we see.
But you also say you see significance in the way their bodies are positioned, and that it forms a V.
I do. Paintings are symbolic by nature. The idea of the V in the painting, the V being the symbol, long before Leonardo da Vinci, the symbol of the feminine. This symbol here is essentially the womb, I mean, in its very strict symbolic sense.
We were only able to find one prominent art historian who said he'd long believed the figure might be a woman and not a man.
In 1979, I said the same thing.
In fact, he was one of the world's leading Leonardo experts.
We are looking at the copy of The Last Supper by Marco Di Giorno.
Pedretti believes that studying the work of one of Leonardo's top students may prove the figure is a woman.
Right underneath, he makes a portrait, a female portrait, out of John, the Apostle John.
The student ended up making a portrait based on the figure seated beside Jesus in Leonardo's Last Supper tableau.
This is exactly the thing that we have seen before, with the same kind of hair, that's right. You know, it's this beautiful curly hair, a cascade like water, and beautiful features. This is definitely not a man.
You're not talking about a painting. You're talking about the Last Supper. You're talking about who was present on the night before Jesus Christ was crucified. The fact that somebody as learned and advanced as Leonardo da Vinci, for some reason, would put Mary Magdalene at the center of this incredibly important moment in history either implies that he did it tongue-in-cheek or that he knew some things that we didn't.
But if Leonardo did know something about Mary Magdalene that most people did not know, who gave him this information? The novel The Da Vinci Code suggests that he belonged to a secret society that passed this dangerous knowledge down from generation to generation. In the early 1960s, a set of documents was discovered deep in the stacks of the French National Library called the Secret Files, or les Dossiers Secrets. It is unclear where they came from. The documents make several references to something called the Priory of Zion and a series of priory Grand Masters through the centuries. The names include some of the most famous artists and thinkers in Western history: Isaac Newton, Botticelli. One of the names is Leonardo da Vinci. Carlo Pedretti was fascinated because little is known about Leonardo's last years except that he went to live in France. He's looked for evidence that Leonardo belonged to a secret Priory of Zion.
And I found a few connections that could not be invented. So I wanted to go to the bottom of it, and sure enough, I got nowhere.
He is still looking today.
If Leonardo da Vinci was part of a secret society that had information about Mary Magdalene and Jesus, what was that society and where did it get its information? The answer may lie in the legends circulating in the south of France.
The Da Vinci Code is a fictional thriller. The plot involves a murder here in the Louvre, the famous art museum in Paris. A body left dead near Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece, the Mona Lisa. A tense nighttime chase through the streets of Paris. Suggestions that the murder is connected to a secret so powerful it could bring down the Catholic Church. And that Leonardo da Vinci himself was part of a mysterious group called the Priory of Zion, who knew the secret and passed it down to a select few for generations. In the novel, riddles containing clues are hidden across Paris, in London, and even in a sanctuary called Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. The secret? That Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, that she bore his child and brought that child here to the south of France after the crucifixion. According to the theory, the descendants of Jesus married into the earliest French royal family, the Merovingians. The author of the book suggests that the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene runs through the veins of certain families in Europe to this day.
So, in your book, you talk about the fact that Leonardo da Vinci was part of a secret society that knew that Mary Magdalene was in fact Jesus' wife.
Right.
And that Mary Magdalene in fact may have born a child that, you know, started a bloodline.
Right.
Where did you find that idea? I mean, what research led you to that theory?
That information has been around for quite a while. And there have been a lot of books written about this theory that relates to the Priory of Zion and the Merovingian kings.
We decided to examine the sources and books Brown told us he relied upon and discovered that there is no evidence of a child or of a bloodline in any verifiably historical documents anywhere. But there are legends that contain some of the ideas found in Brown's novel, which say that Mary Magdalene did flee Jerusalem after Jesus was crucified, and that she ended up in Provence on the southern coast of France.
Now, I believe that danger to her, possibly because she was a mother, made it important for the family and friends of this woman to keep her in hiding. And I believe, actually, that they took her away from Jerusalem. They would have taken her to a place of safety. And that's when we have the legends that say that fleeing persecution, this little boat with no oars shows up on the coast of France. And they bring with them the Holy Grail.
Margaret Starbird has written several books making much of the French legend, which says that Mary Magdalene and Lazarus, his sister Martha, and two cousins of the Virgin all landed somewhere near this town. today named in their honor, the St. Marys of the Sea, les Saintes Maries de la Mer.
All three of them cousins of the Virgin Mary. In Palestine, persecuted, they were put on a boat without any sail or oars. Following a violent storm, they ended up on our coast west of the mouth of the Petit Rhône.
This is not in the Bible. This is what the local legend says, but it is just such local lore that Da Vinci Code relies upon for its theory.
What did you find out about the legend of Mary Magdalene in southern France?
Actually, that is the one place where the story is fairly solid, and everybody essentially will tell you the same story, which is that Mary Magdalene, with child, traveled to the south of France and had a daughter, Sarah, and raised her.
In fact, we could find nobody who told us this story when we went to Sainte Marie de la Mer. What they did say is that when the Marys and Lazarus arrived, they did have a dark-skinned young girl with them, and that her name was Sarah. No one says that she was Mary's daughter.
Une tradition orale raconte que
one story says that she was an Egyptian servant of the two St. Marys, and that she arrived with them on the boat.
She is said to have been a teenager. Today she is called Saint Sarah, and she's especially revered by the gypsies, who consider themselves the resident experts on her story.
She was a young girl of 17. She used to ride on a white horse around this area, saving the lives of all the sick children.
Even the gypsies don't believe that Sarah was Mary's daughter, or the daughter of Jesus.
Oh, sacrilège. Ça, c'est un sacrilège. Ah, sacrilege. This is sacrilege. It's not nice to say things like that about Jesus. Jesus was never married to anybody. Et Sainte Sarah, c'était une Égyptienne. And Saint Sarah was an Egyptian, the Egyptian servant.
No. I never heard of that, and I think that even if people know something, they don't say anything, because one can't be at the same time a Christian and accept this idea.
Mais non, ça se raconte pas en France, ni au Sainte Marie.
No, that is not what is said in France, nor in the St. Mary's.
C'est un problème américain.
This is an American problem.
Although we found little to suggest there was evidence Mary Magdalene had a child, we did find a lot of lore suggesting Mary Magdalene herself came to the south of France. One of those stories took us to this place, a region called Languedoc. This one has to do with the legends of the mysterious Holy Grail. The Grail has come to be associated with the cup Jesus used in the Last Supper, later to be used at the cross to catch drops of his blood, smuggled from the Holy Land after the crucifixion and hidden away in Europe for centuries. The theory we came here to investigate says that the vessel which held the blood of Jesus was hidden in France, but it wasn't a cup at all.
The earliest legends say that Mary Magdalene brought the Holy Grail to France. All the legends and stories about the knights in shining armor running around all over Europe looking for the sacred vessel, the Holy Grail is supposed to be the sacred vessel that once contained the blood of Christ.
But you say the Holy Grail may actually be...
I believe that the sacred vessel that once contained the blood of Christ was Mary Magdalene herself, as the vessel of his child, the vessel for his family.
So you think the Holy Grail is actually Mary Magdalene?
Yes.
Where did this idea come from?
Everything that's written and said, I have to say, is more or less based on my work.
Henry Lincoln is an author whose books are one of the main sources of the story that we read in the Da Vinci Code.
The hypothesis which we presented is that Mary Magdalene, the wife of Jesus, when she came to France and brought the Holy Grail was in fact, if you like, her womb. It was the blood descent of Jesus.
That's what you believe?
No. I neither believe nor disbelieve anything. It's an hypothesis.
In 1980, Lincoln and two colleagues wrote a book in which they pieced together the stories about Mary Magdalene and other bits and pieces of French legend and history. They came up with the story that not only was Mary Magdalene married to Jesus, but that their descendants intermarried with French kings who ended up ruling this part of France during the Dark Ages, the Merovingian dynasty.
The Merovingians have a very strange story in relation to their origin. The first king, Merove, his mother was impregnated by a sea creature, a fish. One of the earliest symbols for Jesus was fish.
So let me first try and summarize.
Yeah.
The first Merovingian queen was impregnated by a creature from the sea, the fish, which you theorize could symbolize Jesus. So the Merovingian royal bloodline would be descendants of Jesus.
Now, of course, he was right on at least one point. The earliest symbol of Jesus was this drawing of a fish. Still, was the whole theory about a bloodline of Jesus in the south of France based on this?
Why not just say Mary Magdalene impregnated by Jesus?
That is not the way that our orthodoxy would have it. You can't have a married Jesus.
It was too dangerous to tell.
Anything that runs counter to orthodoxy has always been dangerous. The church has always reacted with violence. Think of the Inquisition.
Lincoln and his colleagues also examined some strange documents that appeared in the French National Library in the early 1960s, called the Secret Files, les dossiers secrets. There, they kept finding references to an organization called the Priory of Zion, which seemed to date back to the Middle Ages, around the time of the Crusades.
And the Priory of Zion was established to protect the descendants of this royal bloodline, the Merovingian bloodline.
Beautiful. That's very good. You've done it.
That's it.
You've done it.
Lincoln concluded that the Priory of Zion must have been started by the nobles of Jesus' bloodline from this area. He also believes that it created a military arm for itself, the medieval Knights Templar who fought the Crusades, and that the clues to this are found in the famous romantic stories written in France in the Middle Ages. We know them today as the legends of King Arthur and the Holy Grail.
If you look at what the Grail romances tell us about the Templars, they were referred to as the guardians of the Grail and the Grail family. And so suddenly we have that royal family. They were there to protect that royal family.
I believe the custodians of the Grail and the Grail secret were originally the Knights Templar. And actually, in medieval literature, the story of Parzival actually says that the Knights Templar were the custodians of the Grail family. He doesn't say what the Grail family is, but he does call it that.
When we come back, who were the Knights Templar? And did they in fact protect a powerful secret?
What if the Bible didn't tell the whole story? Can the fictional best-selling novel shake religious belief? Secret Bible Week, tomorrow on the National Geographic Channel.